In part one of our story on the banking sector of Belize, we spoke about the Prime Minister being away with a delegation in the United States, attending meetings in an effort to see what measures can be taken to stabilize our financial sector and economy when it comes to the area of correspondent banking. We also spoke on what possible repercussions can be had if the talks are unsuccessful, and how consumers would most likely be shifting their accounts to the international bank in order to have use of the international financial services. In this part of our segment, we will look at the offshore sector and foreign reserves. With the severing of relations by Bank of America on the offshore sector in Belize, about $175 million left the country. And as is, the country's offshore banking industry is on life support. Several persons who were employed in offshore banking have been either laid off or have moved on to other jobs, one of the effects of the de-risking movement. Attorney Christopher Koyi, who once headed the Belize Bank International and up to recently was the chairman of the Belize Offshore Practitioners Association, in our interview said that other affected areas may be the citrus industry, which has been known to borrow funds from the offshore accounts, as well as EPZ's export processing zones and the CFC's commercial free zones. As we mentioned, all this is a result of the de-risking movement, which simply means that the banking institutions in the United States are simply taking action to reduce the risk of being penalized for doing business with countries sanctioned by the United States. Koyi further explained.
Over the past decade and a half, I would say that especially since 2001, 9/11, new laws were implemented. I'm speaking more specifically about the U.S. New laws were implemented, the Bank Secrecy Act, and to attack and terrorist financing and tie that in large part to money laundering or anti-money laundering efforts. And over time, that has evolved. With the financial crisis in 2008, these laws became a lot more aggressively enforced. Coupling those two together, the regulatory authorities have become more aggressive, more intrusive, more comprehensive in their regulation and monitoring of banks on a whole. Following from that, in more recent years, you can see in the news reports a number of large fines, very large fines. I think Commerce Bank, one of the banks that provide correspondent banking services to the Belize banking institutions, was fined earlier last year, almost $1.5 billion. And that in large part has to do with conducting business activities with sanctioned countries like Iran or Sudan, those types of sanctioned countries. Previous to that, I think the year before, BNP Paribas was fined almost $9 billion. I think that's probably one of the largest fines ever, but again, by the US authorities for conducting business with sanctioned countries. When these banks start looking at the risk reward and the exposure to that level of penalty compared to the reward of, I think the Prime Minister spoke of $6 million was the extent of the benefit that they were getting in Belize. I mean, that's not even 1% of those penalties. So when you look at that risk reward, obviously the banks from a business standpoint will consider whether or not to do business. De-risking is not a management of risk, it's simply the avoidance of risk. So that phenomenon, having regard to these kinds of risk reward analysis and the penalties that they have to look at, the cost of compliance, the actual cost of compliance, not just the risk, but the actual cost of compliance, have led a lot of these large banks to decide simply to avoid the risk. and to de-risk from these small banks or even small jurisdictions that do not provide much benefit relative to the risk and cost they're taking on.
Koyi went on to say that not only will the offshore sector create issues, but without improvement of the current situation, Belize's foreign reserves can also be affected. One way is with exporters and importers opting to open a U.S. bank account where their money used for trade will be held, as opposed to enduring the possible high rates being implemented in Belize. Prime Minister Dean Barrow is currently in Washington, D.C., with a local delegation, meeting with the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the head of the Office of the Comptroller of Currency. Prime Minister Barrow spoke on the issue in the House of Representatives prior to his leaving for the United States.
Let us talk about what we in Belize have done and are doing, not what we will do. I took up this issue with President Obama at the summit in Panama from as early as then. In consequence of that, the president set up a meeting for the governor of our central bank with U.S. Treasury officials. After that meeting that the governor of our central bank had with the U.S. Treasury in Washington, the Treasury Department, because we continue to make noise, I just asked the U.S. ambassador to come to see me 2 weeks ago as part of the continuing full court press. The U.S. Treasury convened a meeting in Panama in mid-December with the Tier 1 banks, the so-called Tier 1 banks, people like Bank of America and Citi and Bank of New York, and central bankers of this region, the small countries, including those in Central America, that have been affected. And there, the Belize position was articulately and comprehensively laid out by the governor of our central bank. I am going to Washington, leading a team to make calls on all the key officials with respect to this issue. While it is true that ultimately we can't guarantee the successful outcome of my visit to the United States, we can at least make plain that we are doing everything that we can possibly do, and we can make plain that we will continue to do everything that we can possibly do until we find a solution to the problem.
Prime Minister Dean Barrow is expected to return home on Sunday, January 31. Accompanying him on his trip are Ambassador Marcus Pat, Central Bank Governor Glenn Isigeri, as well as Financial Secretary Joseph Waite. They are in the company of Belize's Ambassador to the U.S., Pat Andrews. Reporting for Love News, I am Renee Trujillo.